72 hours that changed the geometry of this war. 72 hours that rendered every existing frontline map partially obsolete. 72 hours that forced every general staff on the European continent to recalculate their assumptions from the ground up. What Ukraine did in the last 3 days crossed a line that Moscow had spent over a year hoping would hold, a red line drawn not in ink but in military overextension, in thinned out logistics chains, and in the quiet confidence that their eastern flank was secure. And when that line broke, Kyiv did not hesitate. They responded with speed, precision, and a level of operational coordination that stunned even their closest allies. This is not a skirmish. This is not a probe. What you are watching unfold tonight is the opening of a genuine second front. And the First Army to mass and commit on that front will not just win that engagement. They will decide the entire course of this war. For the better part of 8 months now, there had been signals, and not official communiques, not formal intelligence bulletins, just signals that Ukraine was preparing something fundamentally different from what it had shown the world before. Ukraine has been resilient, yes, but it has been systematic in its resilience, deliberate, patient in a way that grinding defensive warfare forces you to be. Their moves along the Zaporizhia line, the Kherson riverbanks, and the fortified corridors near Avdiivka had followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a signature. Hold, absorb, counterstrike, hold again. But what set off alarm bells inside NATO's intelligence infrastructure this past month was that the signature changed. The rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor large-scale force movements know the indicators. The repositioning of heavy mechanized brigades away from active contact zones. The unusual clustering of logistics convoys moving northeast rather than southeast. The suppression of electronic emissions from units that are normally chatty on tactical networks, the sudden disappearance of Ukrainian drone activity along a specific 200-kilometer corridor, all of that went quiet. And whenever a force that has been in continuous contact for over 2 years suddenly goes quiet in a sector, it doesn't mean they've given up. It means they're about to do something they don't want you to see coming. Early this past week, Western intelligence services detected what they described in classified briefings as a significant concentration of Ukrainian combined arms elements in the Sumy Oblast, including armored formations and bridging equipment that had not been massed in that configuration since the early months of the 2023 counteroffensive. These are not the kinds of assets you pre-position for a defensive operation. These are the kinds of assets Ukraine only deploys when they are signaling something very specific. A cross-border thrust, a flanking maneuver, or a calculated attempt to open an entirely new axis of advance that Moscow is not resourced to simultaneously defend. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Ukraine was changing its operational posture in a way that hadn't been seen in over a year. And when a military force that has been strategically defensive for 18 months shifts its posture, even by 10 kilometers of staging depth, every intelligence agency on the continent pays attention. Because in modern warfare, the army that chooses when to move holds an enormous advantage over the army that is forced to react. Ukraine, for the first time in a very long time, is the one choosing. The emergency consultations held inside NATO's Brussels headquarters this week were not routine. They were not procedural. They were not symbolic. They were urgent in a way that veteran alliance members said they hadn't felt since the first weeks of the February 2022 invasion. Senior official after senior official emerging from closed-door sessions described Ukraine's unfolding operation as operationally audacious, strategically coherent, and perhaps most importantly, irreversible, in the sense that once committed, this operation cannot be paused without yielding significant ground and momentum. But strategic audacity only works if the opponent hesitates long enough for you to consolidate the gains. Russia, to its credit, did not hesitate for long, but Kyiv moved faster. In fact, their response, or rather their initiation, in the last 48 hours has been among the most coordinated Ukrainian military actions we have witnessed in the entire duration of this conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of the first Ukrainian ground elements crossing the operational line of departure, Ukrainian air and missile assets began systematically engaging Russian command and control nodes, logistics hubs, and rail transfer points across a 400-kilometer arc behind the new front. These weren't harassment strikes. These were deep interdiction missions, precision operations targeting the infrastructure of Russian reinforcement in a way that Ukraine only undertakes when it is preparing to hold ground it intends to keep for the long term, Tonight, multiple confirmed reports from ground correspondents and satellite imagery analysis confirm that Ukrainian forces have launched a multi-axis ground operation into Belgorod Oblast, the Russian border region that has served as one of Moscow's primary staging and logistics corridors for the entire northern theater of war. Among the targets confirmed struck in the last 24 hours. They hit the rail interchange at Veluiki, a critical node through which Russian ammunition has been flowing southward into Luhansk. They hit fuel and materiel depots near Shebekino that had been quietly rebuilt and restocked over the last 4 months in preparation for what Russian planners anticipated would be a summer offensive of their own. They hit Russian communications relay infrastructure in 3 locations that were almost certainly being prepared to support coordinated command across 2 separate army group areas. In other words, Ukraine didn't just enter Russian territory. Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's northern logistics architecture, the supply chain that would have made a Russian summer offensive operational, the fuel that would have moved Russian armor south toward Kharkiv, the communications backbone that coordinates it all. This is what made the NATO consultations so urgent. Russia's planned offensive wasn't just symbolic, it was weeks away from becoming executable. It represented the kind of operational capacity that could have pushed the front line 30 to 50 kilometers south if left unchecked, potentially encircling elements of Ukraine's Kharkiv defense. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, chose to respond before the threat became a reality, not recklessly, not impulsively, but with surgical strategic logic. They didn't strike at Russia's cities. They didn't target civilian infrastructure. They hit the logistics. They hit the staging. They hit the command nodes, the exact tools of offensive war, and they hit them before those tools could be turned against Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian soil. And here is where the story becomes even more strategically significant than the tactical headlines suggest. Western analysts now believe that Russia's recent buildup along the Belgorod corridor was specifically designed to test the resolve of Ukraine's military leadership following what Moscow perceived as growing war fatigue in Kiev's political circles. Russia wanted to see whether Ukraine would accept a de facto frozen front in the east, trading land for stability, soldiers for silence. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine's military command didn't accept the premise. They didn't negotiate with the threat. They preempted it with an operation so precisely timed, so cleanly executed, that even Russia's own military bloggers, the so-called war correspondents of the Russian mill blogger community, were caught completely off guard. You don't catch Russia's domestic military information ecosystem off guard easily. They have thousands of eyes across the front line, thousands of voices amplifying every Ukrainian vulnerability, every Russian advance, every ammunition shortage. But today, Ukrainian operational security held so tightly that the mill blogger network was still posting about quiet sectors when Ukrainian armor was already across the border. A senior defense analyst speaking with a major Western outlet under anonymity described Ukraine's misdirection campaign as textbook maskirovka, Russia's own doctrine of military deception, turned back on its creator. Ukraine used Russia's own playbook to deny Russia the one advantage it consistently exploits, the ability to reinforce threatened sectors before the threat materializes. That matters because it shows something fundamental about how this war has evolved. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russia's strategic calendar anymore. They are writing their own. As reports continued coming in throughout Sunday night and into Monday morning, the full scale of Ukraine's operation began to emerge. It is larger than initially reported, and it is more coordinated than many analysts believed Ukraine currently had the capacity to execute. Here's what we know about the scope. Ukrainian ground brigades, including at least 2 mechanized formations that had been deliberately withdrawn from the Donetsk front 3 weeks ago and quietly repositioned, carried out the initial cross-border advance, forcing Russian border guard and National Guard units into immediate emergency retreat. Ukrainian artillery units targeted Russian fire support positions that had been active as recently as 48 hours ago, destroying systems that had been shelling Ukrainian border towns in Sumy Oblast on a near-daily basis for over a year. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces operating ahead of the main formation reportedly disabled road infrastructure used by Russia to rapidly reinforce from the north, the exact reinforcement corridors that allowed Russia to stabilize earlier Ukrainian thrusts into Russian territory in 2024. This wasn't just a raid. A raid goes in, takes what it can, and withdraws. This wasn't just a demonstration. A demonstration sends a political message and stops there. This was sequenced combined arms warfare. Air assets suppressing air defenses, missiles hitting logistics, ground forces advancing and consolidating, special operations disabling reinforcement routes. Sequenced warfare is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain cohesion against since the opening months of the invasion. For every advance Russia has made in Donbass over the past year, Ukraine has managed to complicate the follow-through with something that unravels the operational sequence. Tonight, Ukraine is doing it at scale on Russian soil for the first time. Remember, Russia thought this war would be over in 72 hours. They thought Ukraine would fold before the world had time to respond. They thought NATO would fracture under the first serious test of its collective will. They thought the West would negotiate a settlement that left Moscow in a dominant position before the first winter was over. But tonight, the exact opposite is playing out. Ukraine is operating inside Russian territory with combined arms formations. NATO is more unified, not less than it was on the first day of the invasion. And Russia, which entered this war expecting to redraw the map of Europe in its favor, is now scrambling to defend soil it has controlled for centuries. History has a dark sense of irony. The force that launched a war of conquest without expecting serious resistance is now experiencing what it means to have an enemy who learns, adapts, and eventually carries the war home. Ukraine didn't ask for this lesson to be necessary, but they have taught it before, and tonight they are teaching it again. What makes this moment so consequential and so dangerous is that Ukraine's operation came at precisely the moment when Vladimir Putin is under a uniquely complex web of internal pressures. The Russian nationalist faction, the mill bloggers, the volunteer commanders, the Wagner remnants want to return to offensive operations and territorial gain. They are deeply uncomfortable with the grinding stalemate narrative. The Russian economic elite wants stability, sanctions relief, and an end to the financial hemorrhaging that has quietly accelerated through late 2024 and into 2025. The Russian military general staff wants to preserve manpower, consolidate gains, and avoid the kind of catastrophic overextension that defined the early failures around Kiev and Kharkiv. And the Russian public, insofar as public opinion functions in an authoritarian state, wants this war to be over in a way that doesn't feel like defeat. Putin is balancing all of these demands simultaneously while managing a wartime economy, a depleted professional military, and a front line that has cost Russia estimated casualties now well exceeding 300,000. And when leaders in that position make sudden aggressive moves, like the Belgorod buildup that triggered tonight's events, they are rarely doing it from a position of comfortable strategic strength. They are doing it from pressure. They are doing it from the need to show forward movement when internal audiences are asking hard questions. They are doing it from vulnerability. Ukraine read that vulnerability correctly. And they struck before it could be converted into offensive momentum. NATO's formal statement, now distributed to all 32 member governments, was designed to signal something unmistakable. The alliance is not willing to allow Russian territorial consolidation to become the new baseline from which the next phase of aggression is launched. Senior NATO officials said plainly that Russia's staged buildup in Belgorod was inconsistent with any genuine interest in de-escalation or negotiated resolution. That is the language of formal diplomatic condemnation. But in plain terms, what it means is this: we see what you're doing, we know what you were planning, and we are not going to pretend it isn't happening. You don't hear that tone from NATO's official communications architecture unless the intelligence picture is both clear and alarming. When the alliance speaks in unified, unambiguous terms, without the hedging and qualifying language that normally softens every multilateral statement, it means the situation has crossed an internal threshold of seriousness that the institution has collectively agreed cannot be minimized. That threshold was crossed this week. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian nation and the watching world in a late-night video address that was neither celebratory nor cautious. It was resolute in a way that reflected the gravity of what his forces have undertaken. He said, "Ukraine does not seek the destruction of Russia. Ukraine seeks the security of its people, and that security cannot be built on a foundation where our enemy freely stages its next attack from land that watches our border." He said, "Our soldiers crossed no line that Russia did not first draw in Ukrainian blood. Every position we have taken tonight stands on top of a threat that was being prepared against us." And he said, "We are not at the end of this road, but tonight we have shown that the road runs in both directions." These are not rhetorical flourishes designed for domestic political consumption. These are statements from a wartime commander-in-chief who understands that the next 72 hours will be among the most consequential of the entire conflict, and who is speaking not just to his own people, but to Moscow, to Brussels, to Washington, And to every capital that is watching tonight's events unfold in real time, here is what makes the situation even more complex than a single border operation. Ukraine's move into Belgorod did not happen in isolation. It was the most visible piece of a much larger simultaneous operational picture. Along with the ground operation in Belgorod, Ukrainian naval and missile assets also struck Russian Black Sea naval infrastructure for the third time in 30 days, forcing additional Russian naval repositioning that degrades Moscow's ability to conduct amphibious or coastal support operations. Ukrainian cyber operations reportedly disrupted Russian military logistics software across a 3-oblast network, creating delays in real-time supply coordination that will compound the physical damage done to rail and road infrastructure. Ukrainian diplomatic teams in Brussels and Washington simultaneously engaged allied counterparts with detailed operational briefings, an unusual step that signals Kiev wanted allied governments to understand the strategic intent of tonight's operations before Moscow's version of events could dominate the narrative. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When a military force coordinates ground, naval, cyber, and diplomatic elements simultaneously within a compressed timeline, it is not improvising. It has been planning this for months. Western military analysts are now working through several operational scenarios for how the next phase unfolds. One possibility is that Ukraine intends to hold a shallow buffer zone inside Belgorod, perhaps 10 to 20 kilometers deep, as a permanent negotiating position and a structural disruption to Russian logistics. This would be sustainable but limited in its broader strategic impact. A second possibility is that Ukraine is attempting to force Russia to redeploy significant forces northward, creating vulnerabilities along the Donetsk front that Ukrainian brigades currently positioned in the east can exploit. This would be the more ambitious reading, a strategic feint at scale. The third possibility, and the one now generating the most urgent conversations in Allied intelligence and defense ministries, is that Ukraine is attempting to demonstrate for the first time with hard military facts on the ground that this war cannot be ended through a frozen line that leaves Russian military infrastructure intact and postured for the next offensive, that Russia must choose between accepting real demilitarization of its border regions or accepting the permanent reality of Ukrainian forces contesting those regions indefinitely. Today, Ukraine took the option of a quiet frozen front off the table. They didn't wait for a diplomatic opening. They didn't wait for another winter to impose its limitations. They didn't wait for Western allied consensus to harden into permission. They moved. What we are watching now is a test of strategic patience, institutional resolve, and military adaptability all at once. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine can sustain offensive operations inside Russian territory without triggering a Western withdrawal of support that forces Kiev to pull back. Ukraine wants to show that it can not only absorb Russian pressure, but generate its own on timelines and terrain of its own choosing. NATO wants to prevent this from escalating into a direct alliance-Russia confrontation while simultaneously ensuring that the strategic gains Ukraine has made are not bargained away under pressure. And the watching world, from Beijing to Riyadh to every capital currently weighing its relationship with Moscow, wants to understand whether Russia's conventional military capacity is truly as degraded as Western assessments have suggested, or whether tonight's events will trigger a Russian response that demonstrates otherwise. The answers to all four of those questions will begin to become clear in the next 72 hours. Tonight, we have heard from intelligence sources within multiple allied governments who are now in continuous situational monitoring mode, a posture above their standard watch status. They say Ukrainian forces have successfully established defensive positions along the initial line of advance and are currently consolidating rather than pushing further. They say Russian forces in the Belgorod Oblast are in a state of reactive disorder, moving units laterally to fill gaps rather than mounting a coherent counteroffensive thrust. And they say Russia's decision to preposition a large buildup in the very corridor Ukraine has now entered is likely to be studied for years as an example of how strategic overconfidence can invite the exact outcome it was designed to prevent. But Ukraine is not resting on the success of the first 48 hours. In fact, Ukrainian military planning staff are, by all accounts, in active operational mode, assessing Russian responses, adjusting logistics flows, and preparing for the reactive phase that always follows an initial surprise action. Their operation tonight, bold, precise, and strategically grounded, sent a message to Moscow that the era of one-directional pressure in this war is over, and it sent a message to every Allied capital watching from the outside that Ukraine remains not just a recipient of Western support, but a genuinely capable independent military actor with the strategic vision to employ that support at the operational level where wars are actually decided. As this week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what Russia ultimately hoped to achieve with the Belgorod buildup, whether it was genuinely an offensive preparation, a deterrence posture, or a negotiating tool. But what we already know with high confidence is that Ukraine's decision to act was operationally timely in a way that may prove historically significant. It disrupted a threat before the threat became kinetic. It demonstrated to Russian military planners that no staging area within operational range of the Ukrainian border should be considered permanently safe. And it placed a new and unexpected variable into every calculation about how, when, and under what conditions this war might eventually end. What happens next will depend critically on what Russia chooses to do in the next 72 to 100 hours. If Russia accepts the tactical reality and focuses on containing the Ukrainian position without escalating, this moment will be remembered as the day Ukraine fundamentally changed the negotiating geometry of the war, not at the diplomacy table, but on the ground. If Russia attempts a large-scale conventional response, Ukraine and its allies have already demonstrated they are postured, prepared, and willing to respond with measured but decisive force. Either way, the second front is open, and the side that moves with greater speed, greater coherence, and greater strategic clarity in the coming days will hold an advantage that could reshape the entire war. And tonight, for the first time in over a year, Russia appears to be reactive. The Kremlin is quiet. The official Russian state media is running 12-hour-old footage and carefully worded deflections. The Millblogger network, usually the first and loudest voice amplifying Russian military narrative, is fragmented, some calling for a massive response, others questioning how Ukrainian forces reach their positions undetected. And when Moscow's information architecture is fragmented and reactive, it means something important. They are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, not for the first time, but in a new and irreversible way, Russia learned something it has been forced to relearn repeatedly across 3 years of this war, that Ukraine will not simply absorb, it will act. That surprise and initiative are not Russian monopolies. They belong to whichever force earns them through preparation, patience, and the willingness to accept risk. And that the geography of this conflict is not fixed by Russian preference. It is contested by Ukrainian will. This story is far from over. The second front is opened. The First Army, to move decisively, to mass, to commit, and to hold, will decide not just this battle, but the entire remaining trajectory of the war. And we do not yet know which army that will be. But tonight, for the first time, Ukraine has made that question Russia's problem to answer. And we will be here tracking every movement, every official statement, every shift in the operational picture as the next phase of this war begins to define itself. Stay with us.